The American people had never been particularly welcoming to the Chinese or the Japanese. And of course, this was made worse with the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Now, while there were Japanese spies in Hawaii, when Executive Order 9066 was issued in February of 1942, it called for the internment of all Japanese citizens or Japanese Americans located in parts of Washington, Oregon, California, and Arizona. Ironically, Hawaii was not included. Um, the order actually came in response to an earlier order that had already been issued by the governor of California. The Japanese were rounded up. Many of them were taken to racetracks, and families were forced to live in horse pens. Eventually, they were shipped out to concentration camps throughout the U.S., usually in some of the worst places possible. The camps in Arkansas were in swamps, and the rest of the camps were either in high desert or in extreme temperatures, which made life extremely difficult. It's interesting at a time when we were fighting Nazi Germany that we would do such a thing, and not just to Japanese who had been born in Japan, but Japanese who were second and third generation US citizens. The one positive aspect that this had was it meant that the Chinese population had an opportunity for the first time. The Chinese were some of the earliest victims of Japanese aggression in the early 1930s, and they began lobbying successfully by 1943 to have the Chinese Exclusion Act removed. Along these lines, the fortune cookie, which is so common now in Chinese restaurants, was actually developed by the Japanese. It was a Japanese confection. And when the Japanese bakers were rounded up and thrown in camps, the Chinese took over and it became a new tradition. Of course, when we think of concentration camps and we think of dealing with ethnic issues, the Holocaust is the one big thing. 6 million Jews killed. In addition, there were gypsies and homosexuals and political prisoners and communists. And it forced the United States for the first time to really kind of try to deal with the issue of racism and its full impact. And this had a huge impact on the issue of immigration because it meant that we could not be fighting Nazi Germany and talking about how racist the Nazis were when in fact we had racial issues of our own. Now, when the war ended, soldiers began to come home, and when soldiers came home, they also brought their brides with them. Initially, the U.S. government was somewhat hesitant about allowing these women to come, but when riots broke out outside the U.S. Embassy in London with women holding children who had been produced by U.S. soldiers, things had to change. Now, we focus on the war brides coming from Europe, English, French, German, but there were also war brides coming from the Near East and the Far East. As an example, I give you Lewis Ward with his new wife, which he married in 1950. Two pictures, the Wards in Western dress and Japanese dress. How was the U.S. going to deal with this? Because technically, due to the gentleman's agreement, Mr. Ward should not be allowed to bring his wife. Mr. Ward is a World War II veteran. How dare you tell a World War II veteran that he cannot bring his wife back to the U.S.? Now, the Wards were helped in part due to Executive Order 9981, issued by Harry Truman, which ended segregation in the American military. This is a huge piece of civil rights action. It changed the face of America. It almost cost Harry Truman the election, but It meant that the United States needed to be a force for integration, whether the US population wanted it or not. In partial response to people like Mr. Ward and also to the new integration that was taking place in the American military, in 1952, the 1952 Naturalization Act was passed by Congress. Interestingly enough, Truman vetoed it. He vetoed it in part because it did not go far enough. But the Naturalization Act was important because for the first time since the 1880s, the issue of race was removed from immigration possibilities. In other words, it did not matter where you came. All those previous acts were removed. Now, the total restrictions on the number of people who could come in based on the population still existed, something that Truman did not approve of. But it meant for the first time that families could potentially be reconnected, families that had been shut out by the 1921 and 1924 acts. Now, let me change for just a minute and look to another issue. I want to talk for a minute about the Bracero program, which was created in 1942 by Franklin Roosevelt and by Manuel Avilar Camanchero. He's the president of Mexico. When World War II started, America was not prepared. Between 1939 and 1941, America mobilized. We actually had the first peacetime draft. And Roosevelt recognized the fact that when we went full on into war, we were going to need manpower. And like Woodrow Wilson, he looked south of the border for that. Now, the Mexican president was determined that this time the Mexican population would not be used and abused and then dropped back off on the other side of the border. And so the Bracero program was created. The program outlined a series of things that would allow Mexican citizens to come and work in the U.S. They would not be discriminated against. They would be guaranteed transportation and housing to and from the job site. They would be paid a good wage. They would not be used as domestic workers. And they would not be threatened by service in the U.S. military. Between the creation of the program in 1942 and its ending in the 1960s, 4.5 million workers served through the program. Now, it was not ideal, but for the first time, American factories and especially American agriculture had a guaranteed source of a workforce. The workforce was paid, and they even had, they collected Mexican Social Security. On the positive side, it seemed to work really well. On the negative side, conditions were not always the best, and owners of farms oftentimes still took advantage of this workforce. Additionally, over the protests of the Mexican government, the U.S. Congress passed a law allowing Mexicans to come in basically illegally, not through the Bracero program, without any of the guarantees. So oftentimes in the fields you would have two sets of workers working, ones that were being paid the Bracero wage and those that were not. It potentially was going to cause a conflict, but we will talk more about that next time.